This podcast project has been brought to you by the History 5 professors and various guest lecturers at UC Irvine. Hey everyone, you're listening to the premiere episode of Truth, Lies, and History, a podcast dedicated to discussing the truths and lies taught in history classes all over the world. On today's episode, Comfort Women, the Campaign for Compensation. We're here with
Natalia,
Bella,
Yuanzhi,
Karolina,
Lindsey,
and Gabriela.
And we're going to address the topic of comfort women, the past and current perspectives on the issue, the testimonies of the survivors, and our stance on the topic. Without further ado,
Hello everyone. Today we will be addressing the many perspectives that come with the dark and horrendous conversation of comfort woman. To begin, let's define the term. Comfort woman was a euphemism coined by the Japanese military to describe a group of about 200,000 young women and girls who were forcefully taken and involuntarily worked as sexual slaves for the Japanese army during World War II. Mostly between the ages of 11 and 20, these young girls and women were taken under false pretenses. They were under the illusion that they would be working in a job-like position to make money and provide for their families. Worse, the tragic reality was how they were kidnapped and shipped to different comfort stations. Women were held in these comfort stations to be used in whatever way the Japanese army decided. From the moment the women woke up, they were made to cook, clean, and look after the men in the military. Then at night, the women were forced into rooms and were sexually assaulted a number of times by numerous men. This torture was both psychological and physical, lasting for numerous years and even continuing after their rescue, as they were silenced from speaking about what happened to them and deprived from any form of compensation. The psychological torture came from not being able to escape their captors, as they were threatened they would be hurt or killed, which went along with the fear of having no place to run to, as they were held in unknown places. The physical torture came from being sexually abused, harassed, and hit by the soldiers. All of this went on unknown by many, and it wasn't until 1991 that witnesses started to come out and speak about their experiences. These testimonies are what led to a number of controversies centered around the comfort woman term. The main claims made were whether these women, victims and survivors of the horrors committed by the Japanese militia, should or should not receive monetary compensation and a public apology from the Japanese government.
When it comes to the past perspectives of the issue of comfort women, we need to note that these perspectives were greatly associated with the historical agreements and statements between Korea and Japan on this topic. In 1965, South Korea and Japan signed a treaty that normalized their relations and agreed that all problems had been settled, without specifically mentioning the comfort women. In the following decades, this issue wasn't widely discussed, and society tended to discriminate against the victims. A debate about comfort women was brought about by some Japanese writers in the 1970s. Although evidence such as photographs were presented, a lack of testimonies of the victims, official documents, and government statements made it difficult for the public to fully believe in their perspectives. In South Korea, it was not until the early 1990s that the comfort women survivors began to share their experiences in public, which filled the blank of testimonies. In Japan, scholar Yoshimi Yoshiaki found the first documents about comfort stations established and run by the Japanese army, which provided documented evidence. In 1993, Japan issued the Kono Statement, admitting the Japanese military's involvement in the comfort stations and delivering an official apology. However, after Shinzo Abe took office in 2006, Japan seemed to begin to ignore this issue and even try to erase some content on comfort women from textbooks. Although the evidence of the comfort women was clear enough to many scholars, politics played a big part in the debate as Abe was trying to ignore the evidence and cover the truth. In 2015, Korea and Japan reached the Japan-South Korea Comfort Women Agreement, declaring a closure of the issue, but it was opposed by the Korean comfort women because of their exclusion from the making of the deal, as well as their distrust of their president Park Geun-hye. In 2017, the new president Moon Jae-in denied the closure of the comfort women issue, which further incited Japan's denial of responsibility.
The current perspective that the majority of humans have over the topic of comfort women is the belief that Japanese, Korean, and other Asian women were forced to become sex slaves. The actions of the Japanese government caused the women to be sexually assaulted, and they brought upon them physical, sexual, and emotional trauma for life. This point of view tends to be more on the feminist side and pro-woman, due to the majority believing the stories of said woman because we want to completely destroy gender-based violence, sexual assault, and hate crimes towards women. We believe that the soldiers were meant to go to war and war only. No need for entertainment, and matter of fact, all of this controversy on comfort women would have been avoided. To think that these women use their bodies as their moral value and as a source of income is immoral and opposes the ideals of feminism. Nevertheless, we tend to feel almost guilty and sorry that many Korean and even some Japanese women were forced to commit these atrocities in favor of the men. We tend to know that what occurred under the Japanese soldier tents during World War II was acts of rape, which is wrong on all levels, and the situation needs to be further situated. There are many different perspectives that people want to achieve by presenting the history of comfort women in particular ways, but we're trying to not leave behind these past atrocities. It is not to be forgotten nor moved along from. Although the situation has been controversial due to its circumstances of discussing acts of coercion, prostitution, and forced sexual acts that were given to the Japanese Imperial Army troops as a way to reduce random sexual assaults and enhance the morale of Japanese soldiers. We tend to stand by the statement that the comfort women need justice such as the Japanese army to admit that what they did was wrong, to state that Korean and Japanese comfort women were forced, coerced, and deceived into sexual servitude and confined under threat of violence, to hold responsibility for the trauma caused to the woman, as well as the affected Korean and Japanese women to tell their stories in order to convince people to believe the true side of the history of comfort women, which must be preserved, but advocated and taught in its true form of what occurred. The facts of such an event cannot be ignored.
One of the first women to speak out, who inspired and created more evidence to the truth of what occurred on the front lines of the World War II, Kamiko Kaneda states in her testimony, "I felt as if we were taken here to be killed." Her story started when she was only 16 years old. She was lured with the idea of better employment and was led by a Japanese soldier onto a train under false pretenses and was later forced to become a comfort woman for Japanese military. She also states, "I resisted with all my might. The first soldier wasn't drunk, and when he tried to rip my clothes off, I shouted no, and he left. The second soldier was drunk. He waved a knife at me and threatened to kill me if I didn't do what he said, but I didn't care if I died, and in the end, he stabbed me." As she explains how she was forced and coerced, we can see this testimony to further prove the truth of what truly happened. The reason behind the late evidence findings was because these women were afraid to speak out. At the time, they were reluctant to voice their story because of how they'd be viewed by society and family. Luckily, Kamiko told the world her story, and this influenced many other comfort women to do the same. These survivors united and told their story to the opposing claims Japan had on comfort women. Japan insisted to the public that these women wanted to be there, that they were nothing but prostitutes. The true facts behind this testimony is that these women were taken by will, touched, molested, and controlled by Japanese soldiers. The shouting of a no, and yet Japan still considers this conceptual. Kamiko, amongst other women in these stations, endured cruelty and deception, which shows that this was not an act of prostitution. It was disgusting and immoral of Japanese government to continue this, and still to reject the truth and not speak out is degrading. Instead of facing the issue and admitting that Japan created a sexual trafficking system, they lied and only manipulated the world into thinking that these women were liars. This evidence should be spread and retold. The women's story should be a scholarly representation of what truly happened on the front lines of World War II. The actions Japan should take are apologizing and compensating these women for the shameful, disrespectful actions that took place. In doing this, the voices of these women will be finally heard and honored by all.
So, after learning about the past and current perspectives, we can understand why perspectives, whether they may be wrong or not, can be important to talk about. When thinking about comfort women and the quote-unquote truth, it was easy for the group to come to a conclusion about our opinion or perspective. Comfort women really did suffer. They were forced, threatened, and having to go through being used as sexual slaves for soldiers must have been terrible. It certainly is something I would have not enjoyed going through. And having women speak up for what they went through is very brave. Now, since this happened so long ago, it is important to talk about comfort women and what it was. Because before taking this history class, most of us never knew what comfort woman was or what it meant. This is a topic that needs to be shared more to have others speak up for them, because they didn't have anyone to speak up for them during World War II. Speaking up can also be support for them, because even after speaking out themselves, some still don't believe these women. Comfort women, even if some may have already passed, deserve justice, and by now they should have already been given that justice. This is another reason why it is important to learn about comfort women and the many perspectives it brings. With the pressure of people wanting justice for comfort women, it might just make Japan give them the justice they deserve. Because Japan has had a really difficult time admitting to what they did to these women at the conversations. And yes, Japan and other denialists are allowed to have their own perspective or opinion, but it is important to look at the facts and see that these denialists are wrong. So hopefully by sharing the group's perspective, it can help teach people the history of comfort women and convince comfort women denialists to change their perspective.
Alright, so today we've addressed the horrific truths behind the term comfort women, which was a term used in World War II to describe a group of women and girls forced into sexual slavery by the Imperial Japanese Army. The governments involved, controlled by the Japanese, used lure, persuasion, and forceful techniques to take the women, many of whom were young girls. They were kept under harsh conditions, worked until they were sore, and treated poorly while they were expected to satisfy the needs of their captors. In the past, historical agreements and documents from involved governments attempted to address the issue of comfort women, but fell short of serving justice to survivors. Lack of full truths, or spins on the real events, were found in government attempts to hide or cover information on their involvement. In more recent years, with the increase in women's movements like the #MeToo and reproductive rights protests, we see that the more women that speak out about forceful sexual acts committed against them, the more women feel confident enough to speak their truths and have their voices heard. As the years have progressed, we also see a huge increase in support from the public, with protests and movements in support of the comfort women getting the justice they deserve. Social media has also played a large role in spreading awareness of the movement and helping to mobilize it globally. As Gabriela mentioned when she discussed the testimonies of the women who spoke out, particularly the first woman who told her story, Kimiko, we find it important to mention the impact her story had on everyone, from the survivors to the families of the victims, as well as the impact on various involved governments and laws. In addition to influence in laws, we also see influence in education and textbooks being taught in various countries surrounding Japan and Korea. These testimonies also greatly impacted us and our group's stance on the topic of comfort women. We believe in compensation and justice for these women, these survivors, who found the confidence to share their stories of the terrible events that they witnessed and their frightening experiences with the world in hopes of gaining justice for themselves and those who could no longer be here to stand with them.
Okay, everyone, that's it for today's episode of Truth, Lies, and History. Thanks for listening to our inaugural podcast episode about comfort women and the fight for compensation. Please join us again next week when we break down another hot historical issue, the Enola Gay exhibit, Debates and Perspectives. Make sure to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. Bye!